Good morning. We've called this session The Lyricist, and that's, I think, an appropriate name for the writer we're going to be hearing from. If we'd been doing this 15 years or so ago, it would have been about Sebastian Barry's extraordinary plays. If we'd been doing it 30 years ago, it would have been perhaps about your poetry, which you were still publishing then. Over the last few years, Sebastian has emerged as one of the greatest novelists on the scene. Prizes, acclamations, the Irish laureate of fiction. And it's as a novelist, I suspect, that most of you here will know him. But I went to the revival of his great play, The Steward of Christendom, in Dublin last month, and it was as powerful and as trailblazing as ever. He is still writing plays, he is writing novels, he is, I suspect, secretly writing poetry. And he writes everything with a lyrical flood of language which makes him unique. We're going to talk a little about where that flood of language is centered, what its sources are, but also I think we're going to talk a little about why he and how he transcends genres and brings something new to them every time. We're also going to talk about the way that he has mined and dug into not only Irish history, but the history of his own family to produce this extraordinary cavalcade of figures, deluded, forgotten, tragic, who people his plays and his novels. And I think we'll begin to give you a flavour of what I'm trying to say. We'll begin with Sebastian himself reading from, to me, one of his very greatest novels about the First World War, A Long, Long Way, which is also about identity and family and delusion and tragedy. Sebastian, will you read something and explain what you're reading and why?
And I'm happy to read from this because it's dedicated to you. My beautiful friend.
I wasn't going to say that.
For Roy Foster in friendship. And what a friendship. And how my heart beats a little faster as I hear you speak. It's true. It's true. We've often said in total privacy, and we'd never say it publicly, but if we weren't hampered by being straight people, we would have married each other. Although our wives might have something to say, but I don't know. This book was about the Irish soldiers in the First World War, a very complicated thing, which an engagement that took place between incipient struggle for independence and then eventual independence, which cleared the pitch to a huge degree for everyone involved. The 200,000 Irishmen just the men alone who'd been in the war, and 39 to maybe 50,000 people killed, which is in a population of 3.5 million, is an enormous loss. But anyway, this is just a little moment in the book where soldiers are trying to amuse themselves by singing to each other. O'Hara, they're in trenches, or they're behind the trenches at the minute, and they're in a little place just trying to get some amusement out of this war. And O'Hara, which is my mother's family name, but anyway, this O'Hara is going to sing, and then Willie Dunn, who is the main person, he's a very young man at the war, closes it. So it's only a couple of pages just to introduce myself and just to be here and make these people present for a moment. So O'Hara rose now like a prince coming into his kingdom, with a bit of sheet music being extracted from his army jacket, and much to the friendly jealousy, the painful friendly jealousy of Christy Moran in that ordinary spot of Flanders, he placed the music on the piano and scanned it short-sightedly and sang a new song that they hadn't heard, though it was all the rage in the music halls of England. It was called Roses of Picardy. It was a song written by a magician, Willie thought, designed to slay the hearts of simple men. Roses are shining in Picardy, in the hush of the silver dew. Roses are flowering in Picardy, but there's never a rose like you. And the roses will die with the summertime, and our roads may be far apart, but there's one rose that dies not in Picardy. 'Tis the rose that I keep in my heart, sang wily Private O'Hara as plain as he could, so the words would pierce home with proper violence to the composure of his mates. They had never heard the song before. Many at song's end were weeping openly. "My God," said poor Macnaughton. He was mopping at his eyes with his sleeve like a bad actor. His big doughy face was melting and as red as a red arse. Smith looked at Macnaughton, and then Smith patted Macnaughton on the shoulder. It was an extraordinary matter, and one that Willie vowed in his heart to remember. How softened they were by the song. It was as if for those moments they felt queerly vindicated, all doubts and sorrows abating. That was O'Hara's strange work that Flanders night in Picardy itself. There's one rose that dies not in Picardy. There was a long silence then again in the room. Maybe there were 60 men there, all Irishmen of the battalion, the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, and many had seen hundreds killed, and many had killed. Willie himself had killed. Was the song a memory of what they were, or was it still possible they might be ordinary, loving, imperfect fellas again in some other guise of peace? Thank you.
Well, as you can gather from that, Sebastian comes from a theatrical family. And I sometimes refer to him as being born in a trunk, in that old Judy Garland phrase. And I would like to begin by asking about the plays and when they morph into novels, and when a theme is suitable for a novel and when a play. Because the novel we've just heard from is, in a sense, part of a pattern of works. That great play, The Steward of Christendom, is about the father of Willie, the character in that. A later novel, Annie Dunn, is about Willie's aunt. Is Annie Dunn Willie's aunt? She is sister, who again is patterned against the dislocations of Irish history. And I want to know when a story presents itself to you in your mind as a novel and when it presents itself as a play, and do they move from one genre to the other?
Well, as you noticed, for many years, maybe 10 years, I was, having written some prose things, but I was claimed by the theatre. Sometimes you start to do something and it's not particularly your ambition to be doing it, but somehow you become threaded in. And at the end of that period, I was trying to write a play, again for Max Stafford Clark, who directed brilliantly The Steward of Christendom. And it was a play, hopefully about a man called Ennius McNulty, who was a great uncle of mine, who was more or less dismissed from the enjoyment of being an Irish person, was put on a blacklist in his hometown and obliged to leave, which the real man did. My problem, I was manfully, uncharacteristically, I should say, trying to write it, and I did write it. But the major problem with it was that Ennius McNulty was a very silent person, which is great inconvenience in a play, and I just couldn't seem to make the thing stand up. And indeed, what you're always trying to do is prove Einstein's theory of time, that all things are happening everywhere all at once. You know, not to be writing historical things, but actually to bring them present. And I couldn't quite bring them present. So because of that emergency, and it was an emergency in my little workroom, I started to write him as a novel. And that became The Whereabouts of Ennius McNulty. And it was perfectly agreeable to the form of the novel that he wasn't a very speaking person, because we could be in his head, and that was quite a voluble head and quite a wounded head, and a very loving head, and that was the first of this series. So it was really because of an incapacity in me to make him a play that I shifted sideways. And then that slow shifting sideways into the novel seemed to continue, and I wrote Annie Dunn, which was about his sister, and On Canaan's Side, which was about another of his sisters, and that had a sort of inevitability and a seduction and being drawn into yet another world. To be brutally honest, I always felt slightly, well, we all feel imposters in our lives and in our work, but in particular, I always felt that in the theatre, that I didn't quite belong in the theatre, even though my mother was an actor in the Abbey Theatre and my wife was an actor. Somehow or other, I didn't feel my ticket was properly franked. And in the realm of the novel, because it's much more private, because it suits slightly odd person like me to work, in quietness. And because what I love most is to be in that silence in your workroom, where, as Yeats said, I'm a fool everywhere except at my desk. And just that feeling of being somehow, your ticket is beautifully marked for your journey, and you can do it, and you're working out of a place in the brain, of course, that isn't terribly connected to other parts of the brain, and the mystery of that, which is the making of a novel. God knows if I answered your question, but it seems so long since you asked it.
You also led into an interesting theme, which is family and how you use them. I think there's a phrase in Midnight's Children where Rushdie describes Salim as being the person into whom all the family stories leaked. He absorbs them and reconstructs them, but he's the ear below the table, so to speak.
Yeah.
You put your mother into a play, The Our Lady of Sligo, a devastating play about alcoholism and loss, and the loss of lives. That wonderful phrase that begins at where are those lives that were waiting for us, like a store of rich, warm grain, and they never accessed.
The fact that he knows that off by heart is very entrancing, isn't it?
Well, I did write the program notes for that play.
Oh,
so
fair enough.
I'm very close to
well,
it.
It's still a compliment.
But the other thing that strikes me is how you allow yourself to ventriloquize members of your family. And I have to say, and what they think of that. Another sentence I'm going to read from your first novel, I think, The Engine of Owl Light, which I may be the only person in this room who has read it.
Or in the universe, possibly.
You yourself are, I think, rather disloyal to that novel, which is a wonderful experimental young man's Joycean novel. But towards the end, the character says, the central character, "In that room of cold ocean, I wrote out my name for the first time, servant of letters at last, and was happy and felt cruel and wicked at the same time." So when you sit down to move your family into center stage and make what you will of them, do you feel happy and cruel and wicked at the same time?
I feel that all day long, and probably in my dreams as well. But you say I use them, but I like to think, just as a mercy to that idea, that they use me. And a lot of my time is spent waiting for somebody to actually speak, and then I can begin to try and take down what they're saying in that mysterious technique of writing, which is somewhat alien to me, because I couldn't read or write till I was about 8 or 9, and the shock of being able to read, I'm still not over it, that these things with squiggles in them actually are coherent things. It's a challenge to me, but I remember waiting. I mean, obviously I had trouble waiting for Ennius, but when he heard it was going to be a novel, he was quite content with that, and that was a very exciting thing. You can't underestimate the joy of writing. The absolute, because people say I write sometimes quite ferocious stories because our stories can be ferocious, and people say, "Oh, how did you survive that? It must have taken so much out of you." I'm always thrilled to be writing anything because that's your state of being in your workroom. The candidates for books, and these are members of my family, but at the same time they're wholly invented, because the most interesting ones are the ones that only exist as a name and a little anecdote, and that's really all you need to rub together to make a book. And having more than that is quite a great inconvenience if you know too much about the person. But I don't. Yes, I mean, I think there is a wickedness in it. but and you know, there's the salt of wickedness. It's like the salt on your meat. It just, if you acknowledge that part of the human being, I mean, there's a reverence for writers which I always think is misplaced, because they are just as wicked, wrong, and dangerous as any other human creature. But in a sense, you harvest all that dispassionately and disinterestedly.
But the central characters you choose are very often figures who have been expelled, in a sense, from their own families. The central character in The Secret Scripture, Aeneas MacNulty, who is condemned to a life of wandering.
There's this sort of wild paradox in human goodness. I mean, I noticed this particularly as laureate, when I was laureate for Irish fiction, and I had the crazy idea to go into places where my readers couldn't reach me. They were not in a position to come to me, so I would go to them. So I went into, for instance, on one instance, to the Central Mental Hospital, where you are put if you are not guilty by reason of insanity. You might have done pretty grievous things. And I was nervous going up the avenue to that place. But when I reached there, I realized that I was in the company of philosophers, of people who understood more about life than most others. And these marginal people sounds like a diminished condition. And I actually mentioned this to Michael D. Higgins, our president, when he was putting the medal on me. And
nice drop.
I said, it's a curious thing, Mike, that, because Michael's very small, it was a very nice photograph, but it's a curious thing that we seem to have put our best citizens away, some of our best citizens away. And he said, yes, that is very, very true, because he had done a lot of work in prisons. I said, you know, there's something wrong with society, Michael. I don't know exactly what it is, of course, but I can see that there is. I said, Michael, you know, maybe we should have another revolution. What do you think? And just for a moment, his eyes lit up. We'll have and then he thought, oh no, wait, now I'm president of Ireland. So, yeah, that's where it's all happening. And if you know, that other beautiful SB, Mr. Beckett, only wrote about such figures, and Yeats in his plays.
So, two of your recent plays, on Blueberry Hill and The Pride of Parnell Street, they come out of, in a sense, prisons, and they certainly go into the world of people in prisons.
Yeah.
Did that come, were they written when you were laureate of Irish fiction, or were they before that?
On Blueberry Hill, well, it was touring through that time.
Yeah.
And indeed opened, on Blueberry Hill, you know, whether I'm an imposter as a playwright or not, there is a part of you that always wants to get to the West End, let's face it. I had never been in the West End, which is a mark of disgrace on my plays, but this one suddenly was in Trafalgar Studios. But unfortunately, it was March the 21st, 2020, when it opened. And we had this amazing, I mean, it's just play with two fellas in a cell in Mountjoy. And part of the wickedness of writing is to make the audience fall in love with two very people who have done terrible things. Because you're, in a sense, you're showing the people themselves in these men. And we opened, and shockingly, it was one of those opening nights where you almost don't experience them because they're so wonderful. And Mark Lawson got up and was calling to the stage, and oh my God, I made Mr. Lawson stand up. Okay, that was pretty good. But 4 days later, of course, it was closed. Yeah.
It'll come back.
Well,
but
I?
The other thing that brings to mind is the strange marriage of these two guys, ancient enemies, in the same cell.
Yeah.
Your work is full of strange marriages. Aeneas and his friend Harcourt, who set up the home in the Isle of Dogs at the end of Aeneas MacNulty.
Yeah.
A lovely play, Fred and Jane, about two nuns.
Yeah.
Of course, Thomas MacNulty and John Cole, the central characters of Days Without End, which I really want to talk about after this. But you...
Do you know that little play about the nuns, Fred and Jane? One of the graces of writing is that you can write about things that are close to you without writing about them. Not to hide them, but somehow to transmute them or allow them. Because afterwards you realize, oh yes, because the young nun in that, of course, the Jane character is my wife, Ali. So I turned my wife into a nun. What does that say? I'm not sure. And the other character was my mother, who was a great fan of Fred Astaire, so that's why they're called Fred and Jane. But it was a way of writing about that connection. And then, of course, I'm sort of suggesting a kind of love affair between my wife and my mother. I think that, maybe we should leave this geez, yeah. No, but I do think, I mean, I've been alive for 6 or 7 years, and I have noticed that, you know, that there's grace in few things. There's grace in friends. There's grace in human love, and the quality of your love for another person has to be worked on. You have to acquire, and simply being alive allows you to acquire. Is your university of how to love properly and hopefully be loved. And that's the thing I've noticed most about the world, because we are a grievous creature and we're only 200,000 years old. We all come from the same 2 or 3 ladies in Africa, which is an important thing to remember. We're only learning how to be a better creature. And these are some of the better things. And often in these books and plays, there is a sort of desolation, but the figures in the desolation are sometimes poised in the dance of love. And that feels to me like a victory. And I'm interested in victory, those victories.
You're interested in redemption, and people are redeemed through love. Not invariably, but quite often. And often they're redeemed through, as I've said, these strange marriages, like the 2 guys in Days Without End, which I think is one of the peaks of your novel writing, and certainly was acclaimed as such. It's also a novel about the violent origins of America. And you remember we were in Texas together.
I do.
When you were writing that book.
Waco, Texas.
And I remember you speaking to American audiences about the past, the American violent past. The great buffalo hunt scene in that novel is obviously a synecdoche symbol of that. The reaction to your Waco audience, to you, an Irishman, telling them about their past, specifically their past in relation to the original Native Americans, was sensitive, to say the least.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about becoming an American writer?
Well, one of the mysteries of being Irish is this, you know, it's the hugely visible diaspora of Irish people. And what do you do that? Are they citizens or not citizens? Actually, they're still trying to work that out from the point of view of voting. I've spent a lot of time in America, and when you go to America, you are, in a sense, you have a sense of joining, you're just being a figure in a long trail to America over all the years of forced emigration and destitute fleeing of the country, and also making what America is today, both good and bad. Because obviously one of the most terrifying things about the Trump era was that most of his, I was going to say henchmen, most of the men and women working for him seemed to have Irish names, which was very interesting to me. So in a way, there is a sense of, say, of the American Civil War, when you read about it, where you had battles, because when you landed in America as an Irish person, you were obliged, in the 1860s, you were obliged to join the army to prove your citizenship. So you can imagine actually the anger that would cause in a young man who had just survived the destitution of Ireland, now to be put in a uniform to fight for a cause that he didn't understand. But there were battles where there were Irish fellas running down in the blue uniform against fellas in the grey uniform. And they're both shouting the same battle cries in Irish, because some of these people weren't even speaking English. But so in a sense, the American Civil War is also, strangely, an Irish Civil War as well, a hidden factor in it. And all that stuff, you see, can sound tragic and terrible, but it's also thrilling to the novelist, because the novelist is wicked in that way, because he or she is falling upon these seeming darknesses, but with a kind of joyous relief to have found some complexity. The writer's always not, the writer doesn't go in the front door, he goes around the back, or she goes around the back to see what's going on there. And that's how I was reading American history. And that is very distressing, because self-evidently, I mean, it is clear when you spend a year reading all the books about Native America and about America, the cry from your European lips in my little workroom in the Wicklow Mountains is, give it back. That's the only response you could possibly have to the early history of America. Of course, that wasn't terribly welcome in Waco. Although we were very welcome in Waco, there was a wonderful man there, we thought, who was the Chancellor, and he was very keen on Roy, and as a little side dish on me, and wanted us to come back and be fellows, and he was going to shower us with American dollars, and it was all going fearfully well. And he was a man called Judge Starr, I think he said his name was, and he said he was 1/26th Native American. So I was very interested in him. I thought, well, that's very interesting. I'm prepared to love you now. So we went back to our hotel room, me and Roy. He was having a glass of wine. I was drinking the water as usual, and we looked him up. And be the hokey, wasn't it Ken Starr, the gentleman with the bag of Monaco, you know, the terrible Ken Starr. So we thought immediately we had to leave Texas, didn't we? We couldn't possibly do it. But we were so enamored of the $15,000 they were giving us that we actually did the event. Although I'm pleased to say he was only getting 10, we found.
We were lucky we weren't run out of time. Yeah, I think Evelyn Waugh said to the Irishman there are only two ultimate realities, hell and the United States. I thought about that when I was reading a long, long way and listening to you there. But you've also said something interesting about your reading. It was a throwaway line, but there is a hell of a lot of work behind a book that is as lyrical, we'll use the word again. It's an uninterrupted flow, but there is solid work behind it. I remember Con Tobin, your friend and contemporary really? Or
he's 2 months older than me, so he has to win everything first. What can I do?
But I remember him saying that when he started to write a novel, he read around it and thought about it and reached a point where then I only have to work. And you sense the work, and I don't mean this in a bad way, you sense the work in some of Tobin's novels very obviously. The work that goes into your novels is concealed. And it's concealed with tremendous artistry. But there is a lot of work in them, and especially when you recreate the 19th century, the mid-19th century in America, or when you recreate, in one of my favorites of your works, the world of Florence Nightingale and Scutari, and of James Miranda Barry, a fascinating character, who's an Irish doctor in Cape Colony
probably
in
a trans
Jamaica,
person, which is
and a trans person as well. You've worked very hard to get the facts, but you spin them in such a way that the work isn't obvious.
Well, before I introduce them or before I make them up, I have to honor them by at least doing the reading, which, as I explained, is quite a challenge, still in a funny sort of way. I do want to read all the books, but I don't read as a 67-year-old person. I read as a 9-year-old in a way. And I don't read like you read, which would be taking beautiful notes in your lovely handwriting and in order to collect a beautiful harvest of facts and verifiable things. I read and then I try to forget, or I read and then I try and let it all sink back, so that when it rises up in the making of a book, it's as if I have experienced that, or if I have somehow lived that. For instance, and things that might seem unimportant to anyone else reading the book become an entrancing help to me. For instance, lost words. In Days Without End, there's a word I've been trying to revive ever since and I've said it on the BBC because I know they might take the word, but the audience there, but the word is sockdologer. And a sockdologer is the best example of something. And it probably comes, and this makes me think of my daughter, who is a journalist at the BBC for boxing and MMA. It's the punch at the end of the fight that wins the fight. You could be losing the fight grievously, but as long as you can knock the other person out, you're going to win. That's what a sockdologer is. So that was an extremely useful lost word to me, because as soon as you put a word like that in, it sounds authentic. And you're trying to sound authentic, you're trying to seem real. you're actually trying, as I said, to honor Einstein's theory of time and prove it in a certain way, that you're not going back into the past, but you're just accessing some other time events that we are told concurrent, but we don't have the capacity as a creature to understand it properly. Mercifully, we understand time as a narrative progression, which of course it isn't. But thank God we do that, because otherwise you couldn't write a novel. You couldn't write a truly Einsteinian novel.
A true history of lies, as a character says in one of your plays.
Yes.
History is you're writing a true history of lies.
And our parents told us, especially, well, my mother not so much. My mother actually told me, humorously, but did say it at an age when I didn't understand it was humor. She said to lie, steal, and listen at doors. This is her counter-mothering thing that she was trying out to see what would happen, I think. And I suppose I obeyed her. It is listening at the doors of time, isn't it?
Well, this is Salim and Midnight Children again, but it's also an actor's wisdom, I think, lying, stealing, and listening at doors.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in this processing of hard facts. I remember the great Beryl Bainbridge, whose historical novels like Master Georgie and The Birthday Boys do what you do. The learning is concealed, but you feel you're in the moment, because she does it with such elegance, such economy. And she said that she just read newspapers, went to Colindale newspaper library when it existed, which it no longer does, and just immersed herself in the newspapers of the 1850s or the 1910s or whatever period. Do you do that, or is
anything that's attached to the time can be useful, even if it doesn't seem to have a direct relevance, like say that word. But in writing a play like The Steward of Christendom, which is now 27 years since it was on in London, so none of you young people will even remember it. You weren't even born, none of you. Nobody knew anything about my great-grandfather. He was one of the last, he was the chief superintendent in the Dublin Metropolitan Police before independence. So although he was a proud man and had had a long career in the police, of course, by the time he was retiring, the whole force was in disgrace because independence was on the way. And I didn't know anything about him, and not only did I not know anything about him, I didn't even know his first name. I certainly didn't know where he was buried. I only discovered where he was buried a few years ago when my friend Dermot Brolliger brought me into Glasnevin and showed me how to do that. But he's actually buried in a stoneless plot, because his own family were deeply worried and indeed his own son, who fled to America, having joined the auxiliary police force in a foolish act after returning from the war, was murdered in the 50s by the IRB in Chicago, which was 30 years after these events. So there was a great danger. So I didn't know anything about him, and I was obliged, to make him up. But it is a curious fact, this business of lies, for instance, that the more you lie, seemingly, or the more you allow the make-upness of things, you get closer to a truth that seems to be that the sister of doing it from facts, and maybe a better sister. It's a very curious thing how we are constructed and how we construct ourselves, because in our brains here, as we sit here together, the amount of activity going on in your brains, synaptic activity, probably precludes the idea of lies or truth. As you manufacture this moment, all of you individually, microsecond after it actually happens, when your brain has processed certain visual signals, we are all in this vast film of lies. Our very present moment is a sort of vast lie. And therefore we should, maybe I should give more dignity and thank my mother retrospectively for introducing me to the realm of lies, because it might be pervasive more than we know.
It also relates to the accepted lies of a national history in a country that has made and remade its history in the era of independence, which is what poor old Thomas Dunn in the county home is the victim of, in a sense. And your work has sometimes been associated with the work of historians, some of them not a million miles away from you, who have also been accused of rewriting Irish history to get behind the accepted nationalist truth and to show it's an infinitely more complicated, delusional, ambiguous process than the accepted version allowed.
If I had gone back into, of course, the only place I can find my great-grandfather, therefore, knowing nothing about him, is in my brain, in that synaptic suit. And if I had gone back and found a truly evil person, as nationalist history obliges me to think, I would have written that. But all I could find was, it was ecce homo. Here is another person alive in the world, and to be honored at least for that, because being alive, as we know, is quite difficult. There is a rather beautiful word used for you, beloved friend, which is a revisionist historian. But if you think of that, and it's slightly pejorative in some quarters, but if you think of that word, you're going back in a visionary way to see again. To see again. It's not to traduce or rewrite or falsify. It's actually to go back with all that you can gather as information around you and imagine. It's an imaginary act, and it's a saving act. And it was terribly important. It's a sort of solace. It is perfectly understandable that after independence, a nationalist history would be without complication, without all the complicating, tangled wool baskets of things. But now, in this third generation after independence, I suppose we must be, it behoves us to go back, to see again, and add in all these things that were very understandably omitted. And because what it creates, those absences create a kind of hole in the tapestry of Ireland. So you've got this tattered artifact. So you go back and stitch them back in, which you've done in your work so beautifully, and therefore you've a better picture. And not only that, but at the micro level, your child has a better understanding of themselves without these disabling solo monorails of history, which are very bad for you. I mean, my wife, Ali, is a Presbyterian Dubliner. They were told, even when they were kids, they weren't really Irish. Well, excuse me. No one more Irish than Alison Deegan, the warrior Irish queen. So in that sense, I notice in myself I am objecting to the history that we were served up. Yes, that is true, but also this.
You confront it very directly in Whistling Psyche, this wonderful little play about James Miranda Barry, and a great phrase in that, and you just acknowledged it yourself, the great tangled wool basket of empire.
See, you quoted properly.
And the idea that there are threads of different colours that you're pulling out and trying to reorganize and trying to follow in history. I find that very sympathetic. But you've done something risky in a more recent play than that, called Hinterland.
Can I just tell you something briefly about Whistling Psyche?
Please do.
Before you mentioned the dread name Hinterland, which was a play mired in disgrace in 2002. Claire Bloom played Nightingale in that, and Catherine Hunter played my seeming ancestor, Dr. Barry, who was dressed as a woman initially when she was a girl, to see if, by some revolutionary figure, to see if she could become a doctor in the Edinburgh School of Medicine. And she went up there and then lived most of her life as a man. So that's a complicated thought, and you can tell me better than what that is if you want to put names on it. But anyway, one of the entrancing parts of my life up to recently was my wife Ali was working with Alan Rickman because they were doing a film together, and it took 17 years to get this film made. Very beautiful film called A Little Chaos with Kate Winslet that Alan directed in a few years before he died. And so he was in our lives. I mean, when he rang the house, he wasn't looking for me. He was, is Alison there? So I realized my position was lowly, but I loved our friendship with him. Anyway, when Whistling Psyche opened, and of course he was a great friend of Claire Bloom's, he said to me, tell Claire that I thought her performance was totally enchanting, and also I thought she looked very, very beautiful. So I went down to Claire Bloom's dressing room the next day, and I said, Claire, I just want to say Alan was in, and he thought your performance was just so wonderful. She said, oh, yeah, right, okay. Putting on her makeup, whatever she was. I said, just as I was going out there, I said, oh, he also said that you looked incredibly beautiful. She said, oh. I said, I didn't think you'd care about that. She said, that's all I care about. So, just thought I'd tell you that for some reason. To bring her into the room. What a wonderful, wonder person she is.
Well, what a wonderful play that was, but I'm not going to let you away without talking about Hinterland. Which was a short and brutal play that had to be about the disgraced Taoiseach Charles James Haughey, a deeply corrupt figure who had been exposed as being corrupt in almost every way, but who had died recently.
No, he was still alive.
He was still alive at the time, so you were treading a very delicate,
I thought he
and
needed to be
almost
still
dangerous,
alive.
litigious
Yes.
path. And you
Well,
got,
I wasn't. I had
you
no
were not
idea. But
thanked for
Roy,
it.
don't underestimate my obtuseness and my stupidity. I had no idea. We opened it in the provinces in England. Where the hell was it? It was treated as in a sort of somber fashion as being a rather interesting political play. And when we're bringing it into the Abbey Theatre, where now, for some reason, my portrait hangs on the stairs. Hangs is the word, I think, as you're going up to the bar. But anyway, we're bringing it in, and the artistic director of the Abbey said, "Oh, this is going to be wonderful, and we're hoping that Mr. Hoy will come and enjoy this play and understand the spirit of the criticism in it." And that's not what happened at all. Oh no!
All hell broke loose.
I had a phobia about being with my plays on an opening night for many years, and I thought I'll be a bit more mensch-like for once in my life, and I'll sit in, because I thought, this is going to be this lovely moment, play in the main house of the Abbey Theatre. And I could tell after 10 minutes that, I should really start to pack my little bag as I went to the guillotine. Or no, maybe you don't pack a bag when you're going to the guillotine, but whatever, don't pack my bag and go to the guillotine. And I could sense it, and there was fury about it. Because it felt, especially in the treatment of his wife, they thought that was a good reason to be able to inveigh against it as well.
Very interestingly, the son.
Yeah.
Because your plays are very often about fathers and sons, and they are very often about, as Joyce would say, cold, fiery fathers.
Yeah.
And Haughey was a cold, fiery father in the play. Sorry.
Yes.
Sylvester, your character.
Yes, exactly.
Is a cold, fiery father to a suicidal son.
Yeah.
So again, none of Haughey's children, so far as we know, are suicidal.
No,
we
indeed.
don't know what kind of father he was, but this
Which I thought would be self-evident. But
how could you have thought it would be self-evident?
Well, because I'm an idiot. But if you go back, if you went to my archive in Texas, in the Harry Ransom Center, it started life as a play trying to be about my own family. So the Haughey figure is my father, and then Daisy is my mother, and the son is my brother, Guy. But I couldn't write directly about that because I didn't want to write about my brother's mental illness in a public forum, and or indeed my mother's distress as a wife, or indeed my father's quotient of wickedness that he had. So I met a wonderful writer called Nuala Fhuelón at a party, and her father had been rather an odd, drinking, philandering person who was a journalist, a society journalist in Dublin. And she said to me, she said, your father, whom alarmingly she seemed to know, and my father, and Charles Haughey, were very similar people, she said. And I thought, all right. Well, I don't know anything about Nuala's father, really, but I know a little bit about Charles Haughey. Maybe I'll use that as a place to hide my family. And so the whole dynamic in the play is an urgent, passionate, prayerful wish for the transgressor father to understand what had transpired, maybe at his own authorship, and to reverse it and start to do the things which might repair the distress of the people who were the victims of this situation. It's a prayer I had also with my own father, that no matter what somebody does, like that there is a thing in the Steward of Christendom about letting a dog live. And the mother in the play says, no man, well, Thomas says, no man is beyond redemption, my mother said, when he let the dog live. And it's letting the dog live that I was after in Hinterland. But of course, that all disappeared, and what I was left with was a sort of moment where, in the Irish Times, that repository of good instruction, I was being told to leave the country and I should betake myself. And I was terribly alarmed because I had small children and I thought we were going to be crucified by some legal action. and all the rest of it. And I was genuinely afraid. I can't say that I was brave in trenches in that moment.
It will come back, that play, and it's your Ibsenite play. I kept thinking of Ibsen when I was watching it. I saw the London production, and I think it'll come back now that Hohe is dead, now that everything is quietened down. Finally, because we're about to...
are we? Oh my God.
We're about to questions in a minute, but I have one last thing to say to you. Your father is now dead, quite recently.
My father died in January.
Will you now write about him?
Well, he did me no, I can't say that he did me a service, but he was 91, and he had a good death. All the nurses in a hospital strive towards giving you a good death, which is the beautiful thing about nursing, and he had that. But I knew I was approaching the 10th book in this series. Old God's Time, which is the 9th book, which is out in March. This is the proof of that. Is the 9th book, and so the 10th book was always going to be, because people always say, oh, you write about these McNultys and Dunns, as if they were separate entities, but of course, they only come together in the marriage of my parents.
Yes.
And that was going to be the 10th book. So, and my first book, The Watercolorist, was dedicated to my father. Yeah. And I felt, just in the grace of time and in his mysterious way, he might have given me a sort of gentle permission to write that 10th book when he died.
Good.
Not that I had seen him for 10 years, but I'm just reading that into it because I, as a child, the child in me at 67 continued to love that man. So I will think well of him.
Redemption into love again. That's a very good point to pause and ask for questions from the audience. We have 2 roving mics. And so stick up your hands. I'm rather dazzled, so I can't see too clearly, but do we have a question?
Just in the corner.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, is there a book in Irish reunification and the potential creation of another group of exiles on the island of Ireland?
Well, that's what you hope won't be the case, isn't it? I mean, generally speaking. When I was up in Scotland accidentally a few years ago when the independence referendum was looming, they asked me, as they do, what did I think of Scottish independence? And I thought, well, if you can do it peacefully, and if you can do it without a war, which is how we did it, if you can do it in a sort of inspired, almost literary way, then do it. You know, it might be the nicest fun you've had for 100 years. I have all sorts of wicked thoughts. Roy is going to be deeply shocked. You know, there was a country called Dalriada, which was basically Scotland and Northern Ireland, and the roadway of it was the sea between. And that was a very interesting kingdom. Now, it did kind of stop where the Picts began. Nobody knows too much about the Picts in Scotland. And the very word Scotland is the Scotia, or the Scotii, who were the Irish. And when Ptolemy or somebody was making his map, he knew that it was an Irish kingdom, so he actually called that where the Irish were. I mean, it was sort of an error in a way, a beautiful error. So Scotland could also be conceived as the place where the Irish people, anyway, we won't go into that. Don't want to be too controversial. But I thought, I have had this wicked little thought that a very nice little European country would be Northern Ireland and Scotland joined together. I don't know how that would go down, but Dalriada seems to have potential more than some of the other ideas. And also, I'm in the curious position of, as an Irish person, with one grandfather, in the Royal, in the engineers in the Second World War, and the other grandfather passionately nationalist, of having met the late Queen and feeling a great moment of friendship with her and gratitude to her for what she said in Dublin. So I'm also thinking, don't tell it, we could have a sort of new country, just of the islands together, But you could have the Parliament, maybe in the Azores would be the safest place, the Isle of Wight, and just recognise the fact that as we do as having done our dance of death, which is the colonial era, we also have the dance, the inner dance, the secret dance of our DNA. I mean, I said earlier that we're all from the seemingly same 3 to 5 women maybe in Africa. And there's a character in On Canaan's Side, Mr. Dillinger, who's talking about DNA. He says the good news is we're all the same family. All modern humans are the same, come from the same one. And the bad news is we're all the same family, which is what my books are about, because it's very complicated being a family.
Very good.
And I see that as there's nothing that cannot be joined together except that we create these ideas, these awful divisions. But to protoprama, the original thing, is not how we have constructed it. As Plato says, as soon as you name the first thing, it disappears. To protoprama. But the to protoprama of humanity is ironically, such a hopeful and radiant thing that however you might harness that in regard to the problems of Ireland, I would be behind it. And we just need a great scientist of life to explain it better than I would ever be able to do. But the Northern Ireland, as you know, was the repository of everything that was most ancient, most rebellious, and most intransigent on the island. There were people in Northern Ireland in relatively ancient times who heard of the Sassanach reaching the shores. They heard, like the Native Americans had the same experience. They heard of Europeans, but they said, they'll never reach us. We're too far inland. We're 400 miles from the coast. We'll never see them. You know, that's Northern Ireland in a way, as well as all the things it is. And also paying proper homage to the almost accidental history of Protestantism and Catholicism. I married a Protestant woman. Well, it wasn't. It sounds like that's like an insurance policy, just in case. You know. But it wasn't. And the New York Times at the time, when the Steward of Christendom was on, they actually noticed me. The New York Times said, "Will you do an op-ed piece about a Catholic marrying a Protestant?" I said, "I'm sorry. There's absolutely no story. We're Dublin people. It never occurred to us that there would be a division between us. I'm sorry, that would be the shortest op-ed piece in the history of the New York Times." And that's the truth too, that there's much more grace, there's much more comity and unitedness, proper soul unitedness in Ireland than sometimes we're given credit for.
Good point. Thank you. Now we have a question in the front, and there's one behind at the side afterwards.
So I was going to ask you this question anyway, but actually your previous answer leads beautifully into it. And as you can tell, I am from Northern Ireland, so I was very interested about, and from a mixed marriage too. Yeah. But anyway, my question was your...
family, yeah.
Family. We'll discuss some of that later. Anyway, I was going to ask you, so all your books are very much based on the past, and you've mentioned the art of bringing them in so that they resonate in the present. But I was kind of wondering whether you've ever been tempted to write about the future. And some of the things that you're actually saying made me think that if you did write about the future, you could potentially influence it.
That's a complicated question. I mean, it's obviously a brilliant question, and I realize, again, how unbrilliant I am in answering it. But it is a concern that, I mean, since Einstein has presented us with this rather punishing news that we don't have the capacity to understand anything really, so certainly not time. Obviously, if all things are happening everywhere at the same time, all time events, then the future is also present. How awkward and strange is that? So it should be possible if a writer sat still enough in her room and deep enough and sunk far enough and maybe read enough and was proficient in their friendship with Roy and other deep thinking people, that might be able to do that. But speculative novels, you know, set in the future, if I could write about the future as it was going to be, then I would, even as I thought it was going to be, you know, even as I fooled myself it was going to be, I would do that. This Old God's Time is set in the mid-1990s, which I realized shockingly to my daughter Hannah, who's here, is ancient history, you know. But I won't be eligible for the Walter Scott Prize this time because that has to be 60 years. I'm rather thrilled. But in this novel, Old God's Time, they're living in a place called Queenstown Castle, where my mother and I and my sister lived when we were small in the 60s. Well, she was big, we were small. And in this, because my whole set in Dorky, all the dorkiness of it is the 60s. It's as if in this house you can actually somehow, rather disconcertingly for the main character, Tom Kettle, who's a retired policeman, always policeman for some reason, it seems that he's in the mid-90s, but he can go into part of the house where it seems to be the 60s. So, and I just didn't, because we hadn't talked then, it didn't occur to me that he might go into a room that was actually in the future. Dang. Anyway, the book's is all finished and ready to go. But it was a lovely suggestion. I'm going to bear it in mind, because when you are 67 as a writer, you want to start again. I mean, you're always starting again with every book. So I was actually at an event once, not so long ago, and at the event, a person asked me to write 1,000 Moons, basically. She wanted me to write about Winona, because she said the whole account of Winona in Days Without End is from Thomas and John's point of view. She said, and that's not very good now. You need to have her story. And I thought, well, that's still very complicated, because I am an elderly, rather stupid, white, straight Irishman. So it's still, well, anyway. But I did it from a suggestion. So now I will apply myself to your beautiful idea. Try to remind me tomorrow, because I might forget.
We have one. We can take one more question in the minute left to us.
Can I just pick you up on a thousand Moons?
Jonathan, yeah.
Yeah, round about the same time that book came out, there was a novel called American Dirt by an American woman of Irish descent. About
Yes,
Mexican
I know
immigrants.
her.
And her book tour
Janine Cummins.
Yeah, her book tour was cancelled.
Yes.
And Oprah Winfrey had to backtrack and so on.
Yes.
So that whole thing about the appropriation of experience that is not yours. Did you have that anxiety with About 1,000 Moons? You seem to have got away with it.
Jonathan, I'm 100% anxiety. So there's actually no room for new ones. I'm fully stocked. The shop is closed anyway. Nobody ever sells my anxiety, so it's always there. I knew Janine. I met her once in America when I was on a book tour. And she had come specifically to ask me, was I teaching anywhere, because she wanted to be a student of mine. And she had already written at least one wonderful book at that time. And since we were talking about Hinterland, I wrote to her as extensively as I could when this happened, to talk about Hinterland and to talk about. And later, when I was teaching in UCD as laureate, I was trying to talk to my students about what happens when the proverbial, when you're up shit creek and the shit is also hitting the fan, and all the other metaphors. How do you respond to that? What are you supposed to do, given the essential wickedness of writers? So I did engage with that to a certain degree, because I realized she was being roasted alive in her socks, and I knew that for her as a writer, it was this transformative moment where, having written two or three, admired but mildly selling books, suddenly she was being offered, $1 million, and was Oprah Winfrey, which is every writer's secret dream, even to turn it down like Jonathan Franzen. But, at least it happened to him. It's like Sartre turning down the Nobel Prize. At least he got it in a funny sort of way. And I just knew that it was going to be a long, long recovery for her, because her moment of glory, we're very simple creatures. We all are very simple creatures. When we're praised, and you wrote that beautiful book, so important to me, about John Clare, which is not an historical book. It's making him present in my workroom. It was such a beautiful book. I hope you wrote that book. It wasn't another guy. But anyway. In that moment, we're 6. When they say you're on the Booker shortlist, you're not 56, whatever I was. You're just a boy. You're just that boy. You're just the Virginia Woolf, with still hopes that the Lighthouse visit was on, and you were going to have a lovely time. And she wasn't going to have a lovely time. And she became embroiled. But her intentions, I can tell you, were 100% novelish. She wasn't trying to do anything appropriative. She wasn't trying to offend, take away. She was just writing the book that was in front of her. Okay, so I'm sitting in my workroom. It's not so long ago, and I'm thinking, okay, Winona is a Lakota Sioux person, a Singangu person. She's female. She's possibly what we would now call gay. And Thomas and John are her parents, like 2 fathers, or perhaps Thomas is her mother, in effect. Okay, well, I'll sit very quietly and see what she wants me to do. So I sat there for about 7 or 8 months. And then there's that moment at the beginning of the book where she says that her name is not actually Winona, that that's the name given to her by her father, Thomas, because he couldn't pronounce her real name. And I thought, okay, so there's a room. Jeez, I'm in Southeast Wicklow and Winona's in the room. The other part of that book is, in a hinterlandish sort of way, I noticed having 2 daughters that it is certainly not easy to be a woman. And we may think we have arranged society better than it used to be, but I don't know any young woman, and I haven't heard any young woman say that they haven't been, in some way, deeply upset, assaulted, menaced by a man. And I was very concerned about that, and I was on a war footing about that. And that book, which is dedicated in secret to my other daughter, Carl, because it says 2C, so never tell anyone that's Carl, because she'll be very cross. And she's the boxing correspondent at the BBC for boxing and MMA, so believe me, don't annoy that one. It is actually a book for me about human courage, and or a woman's courage, and just as Days of the Light End is dedicated to my son, Toby, who is this radiant person who's also gay. It was a celebration of a daughter in essence. So I felt that's what franked my ticket to do it. And if people had said, well, you can't publish it, oddly enough, 3 years later when it was being published in America, they were very concerned about that issue, because in the interim, this had all come to fore. Somebody in Australia said, because of the Aboriginal history, that how did you get away with this? Maybe it's because it's, well, if I may, forgive me for quoting something, maybe it's because it's so beautifully written, that's the answer. But I actually don't think that's the answer. In a sense, I believe all writers should have to sit in their workrooms with the thing that they've been given, because they don't have anything else. The writer's life is quite poor, it's quite parsimonious. You get one or two things to follow. So I followed that with the prayer that it was a genuine attempt to honor the fact that we do all come from the same 2 or 3 women in Africa, and that all modern humans, that when I meet a chap from Japan, he is in essence my brother, and to honor that, and to try and read all the books I could about the Lakota history and all the rest of it, of course. That bit of me that knows I have to do that, but in the end of the day, allow her the authorship of the book.
Good. Thank you. Well, we're over time, but all I want to say is that Sebastian this morning has not only defined but delivered a sockdolager. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.